What you're about to hear will change how you think about this war, because this wasn't a surge, it was a trap Ukraine set months in advance. Ukraine has been setting conditions for months, waiting for a moment when pressure turns into a break. That moment arrives in a brutal sequence. Ukrainian forces rip through the Russian front line and force a retreat, leaving what Euromaidan press characterizes as a 9.5-kilometer scar in Russia's defenses. I'm Andrew Collins, and you're watching my channel. If this report helps you track the sequence, please like, subscribe, comment, and share. It helps more people find the update, and it keeps these briefings moving. The backdrop is a sudden Russian loss, illicit Starlink terminals used for basic battlefield communication and for coordinating long and mid-range drone assaults. Ukraine exploits that disruption fast. Assaults hit across 3 sectors of the approximate 1,100-kilometer or 684-mile front line, pushing back Russian infiltration units and reclaiming ground that took months to seize. By February 16th, the pace looks stark. Reports describe over a dozen settlements liberated in about a week, and a push edging toward a major Russian defensive hub. This is why the phrase defensive hub matters. The reporting does not describe a symbolic target. It points to a place that helps hold the line together, channel movement, and anchor surrounding positions. When that kind of node is threatened, a retreat can turn from a local setback into a wider scramble to restore coherence. The largest gains are reported in the Zaporizhia region. Ukraine combines assault infantry, drone units, and armored transport teams to retake 5 villages across a 30-kilometer or 19-mile combat line near the city of Huliapole. Russian units fall back across the Huliapole River, an obstacle that had taken them months to cross, undoing gains made back in the summer. Euromaidan press ties this reversal to a Russian offensive that stalls at exactly the wrong time. Russia had spent about 2 months pushing in the direction of Orikhiv-Zaporizhia and Huliapole, capturing the latter to enable further moves west and northwest. Around February 8th, around the same period Russia loses access to Starlink, the pushes in these directions nearly stop. Ukraine sees the opening and hits hard. In the Orikhiv-Zaporizhia sector, Ukraine drives to the southeast, pushing Russian forces out of Orikhiv and Orikhiv. Euromaidan press reports this sets conditions for advances toward Ternova and Berestov. Along the Yanchur River, Ukrainian forces retake settlements including Yehorivka and Pershotravnev, and the reporting describes pressure toward Pribilny, another attempt to force Russian units back across another river line. North of Huliapole, another thrust again targets the Huliapole River. Ukraine pushes Russian units back, crosses the river in the process, and retakes Kozivtseve and Ternovata. A parallel effort reclaims settlements including Priluki and Olnohostiantinivka, tightening pressure toward Varvarivka, already under partial Ukrainian control. Euromaidan press also reports a push into the zone held by Russia's 58th Combined Arms Army. It is not clear whether that push produces major settlement gains, but it forces Russian units back in the Stepnohirsk, Luhanska, and Primorsky regions, and it halts Russian assaults along the Stepov-Pavlivka axis. That pause can be as important as a breakthrough. If Russian assaults are halted along a key axis, it often signals exhaustion, confused Ukraine time to probe again. The last week suggests that once one sector buckles, pressure can spread to adjacent areas, putting more of the occupied line under threat. For Moscow, the damage is not only territorial. Commanders who reported progress now have to explain reversals. Units that were advanced at high cost are left without the ground they were supposed to hold. And the pattern is cruelly familiar. When Russian assaults stall, Ukraine finds the gap, strikes, and the map shifts before Moscow can reset. The figures underline the scale. Euromaidan press reports Ukraine claws back 9.5 kilometers, or about 5.9 miles. France 24 describes the broader footprint. Ukraine retakes 201 square kilometers, or a little over 77.6 square miles, the biggest gains for around 2.5 years of the war. The last comparable scale was the summer 2023 counteroffensive, which ultimately failed. This time, the reporting frames the operation as narrower and more tactical, tied to a specific purpose rather than a deep gamble for sweeping territory. So how does Ukraine do it so quickly? Preston Stewart points to 2 drivers. The first is Starlink, but not in the simplistic sense that Russia's drones stop. Stewart notes some Russian drones used Starlink, and he argues most of those were long and medium-range systems used to strike Ukraine in the rear. In the Zaporizhia areas Ukraine just reclaimed, Russia's FPV operators likely still function. The decisive impact, Stewart suggests, is communications. That is central because Russia's approach for much of 2025 and into 2026 leans on small infiltration teams. Those groups slip forward to create thin claims meant to harden later, but they depend on constant direction and coordination. When communications collapse, those pockets turn into isolated clusters that cannot build a line. The second driver is Ukraine's adaptation. Stewart describes small Ukrainian groups tasked with seek and destroy missions, moving through contested spaces to remove infiltrators systematically. He says these teams may be roughly 12 to 20 soldiers, operating with detailed intelligence and clear objectives, clearing structure by structure and pausing to regroup. Army Inform attributes a similar description to Colonel Vladislav Voloshin, spokesperson for Ukraine's Defense Forces of the South. In that account, Voloshin describes identifying infiltrated groups, what he calls flag stickers, and clearing settlements when they are detected, while emphasizing these places were and remain under Ukrainian control. Russia's official messaging has been subdued. The Defense Ministry offers little detail, leaving Russian military bloggers to fill the gap. Stewart highlights Yuri Podolyaka, who tries to frame the Ukrainian push as ineffective, claiming the armed forces of Ukraine's assault corps is no longer capable of serious counteroffensive action. Stewart argues that framing clashes with other Russian accounts and with continuing reports of settlements being liberated. The strategic aim described across this reporting can be captured in one word: stabilization. Euromaidan Press says Ukraine limits these offensives to the tactical zone, the gray zone areas where fighting was already active. Konstantin Mashovets, whose assessments are cited by the Institute for the Study of War, frames the same logic. Ukraine is trying to stabilize chaotic parts of the Zaporizhia front, not consolidate for a deep drive. The timing is not accidental. Russia is preparing for another offensive in the summer 2026, and Ukraine's immediate goal is to disrupt the timeline for that offensive, something Mashovets reported on February 5th. Summer also changes the operating picture. Firmer terrain, more cover, and the ability to operate at night without risking hypothermia expand what is possible for large formations. Ukraine wants Russia's window to shrink. The Institute for the Study of War reports that part of the Russian summer offensive will focus on the Orikhiv-Zaporizhia city direction, which is why Russia spent months trying to secure the territory Ukraine has now retaken. The Kyiv Post adds that Russia intends to dedicate 100,000 soldiers to this offensive, likely drawn from strategic reserves. Putin has imposed harsh deadlines for assaults in Zaporizhia, and the loss of ground makes those deadlines far harder to meet. Russia now has to refight for staging areas it believed were already secured. That produces a catch-22. Russia does not want to burn strategic reserves it has tried to build since 2025 just to regain territory it thought was locked down, because those reserves are meant for the summer offensive. But leaving liberated territory in Ukrainian hands means the foothold for that offensive is eroding, and it disrupts the agenda of using captured territory as leverage in peace talks. This is why the defensive hub matters. Stewart suggests the village of Uspenivka may be the next Ukrainian objective. If it sits at the center of a Russian defensive setup, it likely functions as a node that channels operations deeper into Zaporizhia. The loss would also be painful on timing. Russia has occupied Uspenivka since early November 2025, and it has used it to block Ukrainian units fighting in the Novomikhailivka region. If Ukraine takes it, the counteroffensive phase may end with Russia's logistics squeezed and Ukraine shifting to preparation. All of this is tied to the gray zone problem. Infiltration tactics blur what control means because a small unit can slip forward while Ukrainian forces still operate nearby. Those footholds force Ukraine to spend resources clearing them, like the counterattacks described in the week leading up to February 26th, but Ukraine would rather restore stable lines that can be fortified. Euronews notes that Russia was already struggling to secure staging points for its summer offensive, and Ukraine has now removed several potential points through this counteroffensive. Stewart argues the front line is moving further away from Zaporizhia, enabling stronger defenses and the creation of kill zones described as extending for as far as 15 kilometers or 9.3 miles. The danger does not need to be seen to shape decisions. A drone may be overhead at any moment. With over a dozen settlements reported liberated, Ukraine has space to turn reclaimed ground into a defensive network built to punish any attempt at reoccupation in the summer. Before we close, please like, subscribe, comment, and share. It helps the channel grow, and it helps others find these updates when the situation changes fast.